Hello, everyone. We're going to talk today a little bit about international trade. We're going to talk about absolute versus comparative advantage, trade barriers, free trade, protectionism, and so forth. So we're going to go ahead and be reading chapters 18.1 and 18.3. And we're going to go ahead and be answering these 5 questions together. So if you look on page 428, we'll be looking at what's called absolute and comparative advantage. Okay, so one of the most important concepts to understand about international trade, the trade between nations, is that it encourages specialization. So what happens is it encourages one country to make one thing, another country to make something else, and then they trade, then they both become better off. And in order to fully understand this, you need to understand a couple of concepts. The concepts are absolute and comparative advantage. So, absolute advantage, if you look on page 428, the book says a nation has an absolute advantage in producing a certain good when it can do so with greater efficiency than can its partner in trade. So basically, absolute advantage means if a nation has an absolute advantage in doing something, they're basically faster and more efficient at it. So if the United States can make 1,000,000 cars per year and Japan can make 500,000 cars per year, the United States is going to have an absolute advantage in making cars. They're just faster and more efficient at it. So you could use that as an example. You could also use the example in the book on page 428. Now, this is a little different than comparative advantage. When you have the comparative advantage in something, that means you could produce something at a lower opportunity cost. Basically, you give up less to produce something. So let's say for the United States, they have to give up 5,000 cars to make a computer, while Japan has to give up 100 cars to make a computer. Japan is going to have the comparative advantage in making computers because it gives up less cars to make a computer. So you're kind of looking for the smaller number. Who's giving up less when you're looking at comparative advantage? So that could be an example, or you could look at the example on page 428. So the important thing to understand with international trade, what economists have found, is that countries will specialize where they have the comparative advantage, where they give up less to produce, and then they'll trade, and then they'll both become better off. And that is the basis behind international trade theory. All right, so now I want to talk a little about trade between nations, and specifically for number 3, the 3 types of trade barriers. So if you turn with me to 18.3 on page 439. And you can see the 3 different types of trade barriers. Basically, a trade barrier, as you can see on page 439, is a government action that's designed to protect domestic industries and jobs from foreign competition. So basically, the government is setting up barriers to trade to help domestic producers within that nation. There's 3 different types. The first one is a tariff. Okay, a tariff is a tax on imports. The second one, if you turn the page and go to 440, is a quota, also called an import quota, which sets a limit on the amount of imports coming into a nation. So it limits the amount of stuff from other nations that can be traded into a nation. It limits imports. That is a quota. And then finally, you have an embargo. And an embargo basically cuts off imports and exports. It cuts off trade to an entire nation. All right, then finally, let's go to number 4 here, free trade versus protectionism. You'll see that on page 441. Basically, free trade, if you have an economist that is in favor of free trade, that means they are not in favor of trade barriers. The government shouldn't be setting up barriers to trade. The government shouldn't be regulating. Countries should be able to freely trade with each other. This is different than protectionism, which basically says you should use tariffs, quotas, etc., in order to favor domestic industries, in order to protect the industries within a nation. Now, there's been quite the push over the past several decades for free trade. And a good example of that, if you look on page 445, is NAFTA. You'll see in blue it says NAFTA. That stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. And it is a free trade agreement that was put forth and signed by the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So that's a good example of a free trade agreement, NAFTA. All right, we will go ahead and go from there. I will check these reading questions tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye.